everybody, and welcome to an utter short review from Indie Film Cafe. I'm your old pal, the Moo Cow, and today we are going to be presenting a classic horror film from 1963. Yes, we are talking about Mario Bava's anthology horror film, Black Sabbath. And just for the sake of continuity, just want to let you know this is going to be the AIP cut versus the original Italian cut because I haven't got the original Italian cut quite yet, but I do want to get the Blu-ray at some point when it's out there. And yeah, I kind of got to go with the one that I've got. So in any event, this is the AIP cut, again, directed by Mario Bava, and it was originally, I believe the Italian version is called Three Faces of Fear. Um, but the thing is that there are some significant differences. I know the way that it's arranged because there's three short films that are put together, and when AIP got a hold of it, they decided to rearrange it. So in the AIP version, the very first one is called A Drop of Water, which is kind of a ghost story. And then the second one is called A Telephone, and that's like an early sort of Giallo light kind of a movie. And then the last one is probably the most famous one, the Verdel Act, with Boris Karloff, which is kind of a creepy vampire one. And in the original Italian version, excuse me, it was the telephone that actually came first, followed by the Verdel Act, and then finally the Drop of Water. Um, Having seen the AIP version, and that's the version that I'm most familiar with, that I had always seen, I'm not sure how I would feel seeing the order kind of reversed. And then the other thing is that they added in some sort of connecting information or connecting scenes with Boris Karloff. He's sort of like the introductory guy, and he's there to provide some creepiness and some exposition, but he's also adds a level of humor there, which is, okay. For the day, it's kind of fun and it's kind of all right, but, it's the kind of thing you might see like a third rate horror host kind of do in between segments, as a sort of connector between the stories. And I understand its function. I'm just not really particularly wild about it. But Karloff does an okay job here, and apparently he was pretty fond of him hamming up in between those bits. So, but you do get to see him acting for real in the Verdel Act, and he's really really good. So I will approach these three separate stories in the AIP version because that's just the traditional way that I've always done it. So the first one is called A Drop of Water, and it is a ghost story. And oh, and by the way, before I forget, these are three classic stories that were adapted. Their screenplays were adapted from short stories by three great writers: Anton Chekhov, Alexei Tolstoy, and Guy de Maupassant. So the first one is Drop of Water, and it is a ghost story, and it's a fairly creepy one. It's also the shortest of the group, which I think is one reason why it's sort of pushed out to the front in the AIP version. So basically, you've got this person named Helen, whom I think is a nurse, and she has been asked to go to this creepy old lady who's a medium, and she's been helping her by giving her like shots. I think they said camphor shots or something like that. And there's this maid there named Millie who's sort of terrified of everything and just saying things like, oh, she was talking to the spirits of the dead and was doing all this creepy shit. And she's terrified and she doesn't want to be around there. And she's dying to have Helen in there. And Helen doesn't really give a hoot. She doesn't believe any of that stuff. However, she does notice that the old bet has a really, really nice, shiny, expensive looking ring. So the first chance she gets, she takes that ring, even though Millie's been dropping hints about how the dead spirits are the ones who are responsible for the old lady's death. And if anybody touches any of her stuff, they're going to get haunted too. And, Helen doesn't really quite believe it. And either way, her greed gets the better of her. So she takes the ring off, she sticks it in her bra, as you do. And then after they get the corpse dressed for I guess the next day for when the undertakers come. And meanwhile, the corpse is like looking all fucked up and shit. It's really kind of creepy. Um, so she finally leaves and goes back home. Well, once she's home, all shit starts to go nuts. She starts hearing drops of water, first from a faucet in the kitchen, then there's a faucet in the bathroom, and then there's of course it's raining because it's all atmosphere and stuff. And there's a window that opens up and there's water coming from there, and there's drops of water all over the place. And then there's a fly that she had seen that it was on the corpse at the house. Now she's seeing it at her place, and she's freaking out trying to brush her away. Excuse me. And then finally, she starts seeing the creepy corpse, and all of a sudden there's this thing going right there, and it's showing up, and it's freaking her out, and it's sitting in a rocking chair, and it's in her bed, and she's trying to get away from it, and all of a sudden the whole thing is just walking towards her like this, and she's just falls on her knees and is begging, please have pity, don't kill me, you horrible, awful corpse. And then you see these hands kind of going on her and choking her, and then the camera pulls back and it's her herself doing it. And how ironic, the next day a neighbor has found her and she's dead, and she also looks all fucked up like and there's a cop there and he's asking about what's going on, and the neighbor's like, oh yeah, we heard a commotion, we broke in, we found her like that, I chased everybody else away, called the cops. And the coroner's like, oh yeah, she looks like she died of fright. Oh, and somebody pulled her ring off. And then the neighbor's like, oh. And yeah, so yeah, you're definitely given the impression that whatever happened to poor Helen's going to happen to this nosy neighbor. So there you go. So that's the end of the very first one, the drop of water. The second one is called the telephone. It's one of the longer segments. It might be the longest one. I'm not 100% sure, but it's a little bit more of the Giallo kind of style, where it's not really supernatural. It's basically this chick getting stalked, and the chick is named Rosie, and is played by Michelle Mercier, who was very famous in the 60s. She was a famous actress. She was known for playing in a movie called Angelique, where she was the main character, and that character sort of haunted her for the rest of her career. But she was a really, really beautiful French actress who was kind of an early rival of Brigitte Bardot. She was in a bunch of movies, things like Dance of Death and Avengers of the Seven Seas, Web of the Spider, a whole bunch of other stuff. And she was quite lovely, and she gets to flit around in poofy, diaphanous, mid-50s, 60s dressing gowns, whatever the hell those things are, looking gorgeous and amazing. And she is being haunted by some guy who keeps calling her up and threatening her. Somebody by the name of Mark. Apparently, he was some kind of ne'er-do-well, and she turned him in, whatever that means, but he died because she's like, you died, you should be leaving me alone, blah, blah, blah. But he keeps calling her up, and apparently he didn't die. And it's not some kind of ghost thing, because you actually see the guy creeping around outside. You can see eyes behind sort of blinds and things, and he's basically stalking her in a very sort of Gallo kind of way. Um, it's kind of weird, because to me this is the weakest one, because you could just hang up the phone, and not get haunted by him. You can do things like lock the door, close the windows. You can do like things. You can take steps to protect yourself. All she does is she ends up calling this other chick, Mary, played by Lydia Alfonsi, who is probably most famous for being in the 1958 Hercules film. And she was in a bunch of TV things, and then she ended up, I think her last thing was in the Robert Benigni Life is Beautiful movie in 1997. I forget who she plays. But so she comes over there and she's like, you're nuts. And I'm just going to give you this sedative, which always ends well. And it's going to knock you out in sleep. And meanwhile, I'm going to write this note saying, you're nuts. And you think this guy who's dead is coming back to get you. So we're going to take you to a doctor because you're crazy boots. And while she's writing this, here comes Frank, who's very much not dead. And in classic Giallo fashion, he sneaks up on her and gets a pair of nylons that has just kind of been sitting there, and just wraps it around her and just strangles her and kills her. And that's the end of Mary. Meanwhile, Rosie has heard all this, and even though she was given a tranquilizer, she wakes up. And and before she got uh, whacked, Mary did the one bright thing, which is to say, "Here's a knife, just in case. You never know. We're going to stick this under your pillow." And it's a good thing she does, because that knife comes back. It's just like the old thing about the short story: if there's a gun introduced, it better go off in the end. Well, this knife goes off in the end, because Frank ends up cornering her. She goes reaching behind the pillow, and he's just about to strangulate her, and she's like, and shoves it in them, and he's dead. And then the segment ends where she's just kind of screaming, "Ah!" It's not really that scary anymore. A, you could have done stuff to make it not happen, and B, you killed the guy. And then it's sort of like his voice later on saying, "I'm still going to haunt you," and blah 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 blah. It's like, you're really dead, and I know it because I'm the one who killed you. So there really shouldn't be anything particularly frightening about that. I mean, I guess if you were sort of a young woman living alone somewhere in the 1960s, like 1960, this will probably creep you out. But in 2021, there's been too much water under that bridge at this point for anybody to not want to just say, "Hey, you just got to do blank, 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 and blank, and you're done. Lock the door. There's your number one thing." So then we end up going into the third and final and best segment, which I think is probably why AIP ended up sticking this one towards the end. That's the Verdel Act. And because it's so strong and it kind of dominates the rest of the film, I think they were very wise in putting it towards the end, sort of ending it with a bang and beginning with the shortest one and having the weakest one in the middle. It probably makes sense. So the Verdel Act is a vampire film, or a vampire story, that's based that it's a vampire, traditional Eastern European vampire, but it drinks the blood of the people that it loves. So it's like haunting your family, which is kind of a particularly wicked, nasty version of being a vampire, because I guess you have no interest or can't get sustenance from drinking the blood of strangers. You got to go after the people that you used to love. Isn't that nice? So a little bit of extra torture there. So Boris Karloff plays Gorka. He's kind of the main guy. And then there's Mark Damon, who plays Count Vladimir. And Mark Damon he was a leading man in the 50s and 60s, especially the 60s, and especially in a lot of European stuff. And if you see any sort of Eurotrash movies from the 60s and 70s, you're going to run into Mark Damon. He was just kind of the guy for a long time. He had a few things in America as well. I know he was part of Das Boot in some kind of way. I don't remember how exactly. He might have been a producer in that, but he's been a bunch of other stuff too. And of course, Boris Karloff, we all know him. He's one of the great classic horror movie icons. And then probably the third person that radiates from this particular story is Zdenka, who's played by Susie Anderson. She's the tall, busty peasant chick in there. She was in Thor and the Amazon Women, War of the Zombies, and a movie called The Labyrinth of Sex in 1969, which I think was just about her last film. She didn't really seem to make it much out of the 60s. And this is like a very creepy, traditional kind of Eastern European Gothic vampires tale. And it doesn't end well for everybody. Mark Damon's sort of riding along, minding his own business, and then he runs into a corpse, a beheaded corpse with a dagger in it, and sort of like, "Oh, well, that's interesting." And then he drags the corpse to the nearest farmstead, and it turns out it's this Turkish bandit who's been killing people in the area. And the guy who's there says, "Yeah, my dad went off to kill him, but he said that if he's not back in 5 days, he's probably become a Verdel Act, and don't let him in." And Mark Damon's like, Verdel Act. Don't know what that is. Sounds interesting. Wow, you got a cute sister. I'm going to hang out for a while. So he decides to hang out. And sure enough, At the end of 5 days, here comes Boris Karloff, who never blinks throughout the whole movie. So that's kind of hint number one. Something's not quite right. Hint number two is his favorite dog never stops howling until he forces them to shoot it. That's probably a big hint there, too. He's acting all crazy pants. Um, he has some very unhealthy obsession over his grandson. His little grandson is like about 6 or 7. That's creepy as fuck. And it's all shot in this sort of very 60s AIP style with a lot of bright lights. So very red over here, very yellow over here, very purple over here. And, it can be very garish and overdone sometimes, but it actually, for whatever reason, it makes it seem even better. Because usually a lot of the classic Bava films of the period are black and white, and that just makes the gothic part of it seem even better. So the color thing, Hammer does a pretty good job with color, but AIP is not quite up to Hammer standards, but it's not too bad there. It's not quite so overdone and garish. So it still retains a very creepy gothic feel to it. Um, so as far as the Verdel Act goes, yeah, there's all kinds of shits and giggles that happens, and he ends up munching on the kid. Kid comes back to life. The mother has a freak out because we all know when your kid becomes a vampire, you got to take his head off, and mom's like, "You're not doing that," and she has a wig out, even though it's obvious, and even though they buried the kid and he's back from the grave. She's like, "You're not going to do it." In fact, when the husband tries to do it, she pretty much knifes his ass and he drops. She goes and lets him in, and actually, the kid's not there. It's Boris Karloff. And so he pretty much kills them all. Mark Damon tries to save Susie Anderson's character, Zdenka, and takes her away on his horse. They ride off and hide in a safe place, which is to say, basically a ruined cemetery in a crypt, because that's safe. And naturally, the whole vampire family comes and tracks her ass down, and they steal her back. He wakes up and says, "Oh my goodness, Hottie Pants is gone." He treks all the way back, and he's like, "But I love you, even though I've only met you for a couple of days." And although, okay, you're hot. And she's like, "Oh, kiss me." And everyone's like, "No, you don't want to kiss her." And of course he does. And she's like, "Munch, munch, munch." And that's pretty much the end. So yeah, one of those movies where everybody dies, and that's the end. Um, Pretty interesting. I like it. I really am a big Bava fan, and I in particularly love some of the earlier black and white gothic ones with Barbara Steele. Those are just some of the classic films. Um, it's this one is not so bad. Um, I'd say it's not quite as good as some of Bava's earlier work, but it's still pretty awesome. I think Quentin Tarantino said that this is one of his most favorite films, and as far as the film that actually inspired him. And a lot of people probably said that too. And you can see a lot of the same tropes that are established in here and by Bava earlier used by other directors and other movies in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, and hell up until today. So Black Sabbath remains kind of an important touchstone uh, gothic, even though it's in color, film. And overall it's pretty good. The like I said, the connecting segments with Karloff kind of hamming it up a little bit. I don't know. It's okay, I suppose. I guess we're all supposed to sort of enjoy the fact that Karloff is playing against type for a change, instead of being the creepy, evil, horrific monster, or the other sort of sympathetic monster. That he's actually playing it for comedy, and he rarely ever gets a chance to do that. So I understand. Um, and that's kind of cool in its own way. But overall, for today's audience, it kind of comes across as a bit of weak sauce. But overall, it's still a pretty darn good film, and I really, really would love to get my hands on a Blu-ray version of this. I'm sure I'm going to. I don't remember if it's Vinegar Syndrome or Kino Lorber or who put it out, but I'd like to get it. I'd like to see the original Italian cut with some of the different intros and some of the rearrangement. Plus, I'm not exactly sure exactly how much stuff is missing. There may be more footage that's in the original. I'd be very curious to see that. So, Yeah, we will check that out. So if I manage to get that on Blu-ray, maybe we'll bring it back um, for one of our other films, maybe Forgotten Horror Classics. I don't know how forgotten this one is. I think a lot of people who understand and who know horror movies especially from the '60s, they probably know Mario Bava's work. But you never know. It doesn't necessarily have to be forgotten. Forgotten. It's nice to have a classic, good movie. Considering all the stinkers we usually do on Indie Film Cafe, but in any event, even if you do end up with the AIP cut, it's still a pretty good film overall. It's got a little weakness in the middle segment, but overall, it's a pretty darn good film. So I'd say go out and get it, and you'll probably end up enjoying it. It's got a few tropes and things that you might kind of roll your eyes a bit for these days, but overall, it's a pretty darn solid horror film. So there you go. That about wraps it up for this episode of Short Reviews, and we will see you on Indie Film Cafe on the flip side. It's your old pal, the Mook House, saying bye.